stops recording for posterity. But it's time to move on. We're still in chapter 1. If you remember, we were just finishing up chapter 1. We have Mishnah 6 and Mishnah 7. And they're going to bring back a concept which we touched on when we did brachot, but is extremely important to classical Jewish observance and conception, and is totally foreign to almost every modern Jew. And that's the idea of something which is tahor or tameh, something that is ritually pure and something that is ritually impure, because these ideas are not something that we use in an average day-to-day kind of life. They still work. I mean, they still, what's the legal term? They are still operative ideas, but the main focus of them is no longer around. The main focus of things that were ritually pure and impure in the ancient world had to do with the temple in Jerusalem. Temple is not there, therefore many of the ideas no longer have immediate relevance. But as we're going to see, they still contain within them seeds of knowledge and of insight and of thinking that are very important. So with that, let's dive in. And we're going to hit some big concepts just in the very first part of Mishnah 6. So we're Pesachim, chapter 1, Mishnah 6. I need a volunteer. Yerach is volunteering.
Yeah. Mishnah 6. Rabbi Hanina, the vice chief of the priest, said.
So you know what he's saying comes from personal experience.
Yeah. During all of the days of the priest, they never refrained from burning sacrificial meat which had been defiled by an offspring of uncleanness with meat which had been defiled by a father or of uncleanness, even though they add uncleanness to its uncleanness.
Okay, isn't that clear?
Very much.
Okay, so first thing you'll notice is what happened to Passover. What are we talking about here? So this is a setup for the argument that's going to come in the next Mishnah. So it's giving us the groundwork before we get to that. And so first of all, we have to understand what they mean by the father of uncleanness and the offspring. Right? So in the Jewish idea of ritual impurity, there are things that can cause ritual impurity and things that have become ritually impure but can't cause it further. Right? So, a classic example would be of an av tumah, of something that is a father of ritual impurity, is a corpse, a dead body. Right? So the dead body causes ritual impurity to everything that's within the same room, or anything that touches it. Exactly. For both categories. So if I am taking care of the deceased, which of course is a mitzvah and needed to be done, very important to remember that something that is ritual impure is not bad. It's not wrong to become ritually impure for the right reasons. So I come into contact with the body, I'm preparing it for the funeral, a very sacred duty. I've now become ritually impure as an offspring of this, and that means I am a slightly lower level of ritual impurity. And if I cannot transmit the same way this can transmit, the same way the body transmits. So it's almost as though the ritual impurity that is affecting me is weaker than what was affecting it. Think of it like think of it like radiation, right? So the father of ritual impurity, that's like plutonium, right? So plutonium is always radioactive. It's just always glowing. And when it comes into contact and you pick up a piece of plutonium, you put it down, your hand has now become radioactive too, right? So this is like, your basic radiation suit. I'm wearing a radiation suit. I go in, I handle the plutonium, I put the plutonium down, I come back, the suit is now contaminated. It doesn't have the same power to recontaminate more, just a little.
Yeah.
the plutonium is still glowing. This is less, and then if I touch something, it's even less, and it can go down in multiple levels. So the question here is, since the ritual impurity of this is greater than the ritual impurity of this, can I combine them? Can I add one to the other? Not physically can I, but should I? Because what they're talking about here is we have this, the extra meat that has to be removed, it has to be disposed of, right? Certain times when you don't finish the meat from a sacrifice, you don't get to put it in your Tupperware and eat it next week. It has to be eaten within a certain time period, and if it isn't eaten, it is burnt out, right? And so if something is ready to be burnt, if something is ready to be burnt that has become ritually defiled as an offspring, can I also burn with it at the same time something that has become ritually defiled as a father? Right, so you got to imagine, and pardon my illustration, right? You have the fuego, the fire, right? And I'm going to switch over to blue because we have blue meat. And I've got my piece of meat here. That's my offspring meat, right? This is the category they're talking about right here, right? They never refrain from burning which have been defiled by an offspring with what have been defiled by uncleanliness. Can I, and you can reverse this really either way, can I take another piece of meat, we're just going to write Av, it's the father meat, can I throw this into the fire and burn them together, even though this one will make this one's ritual impurity go up?
I think you can.
Well, that's what he just said, right? So that's what Rabbi Hanina just said, is that it's okay. That even though you're making this one more ritually impure while you're burning it, it's okay to burn them together. It's okay to burn them simultaneously. We got the scenario? Mishnah 6 from chapter 1.
Right. I don't know if I missed it, but what's the purpose of burning it? Is this a way of...
This is disposing of ritual objects that are no longer usable. So they can't be used for anything else. Okay. So you have to get rid of it. And burning was the means by which you got rid of it without leaving yourself with a ritual object that was improperly...
Okay, so we're burning it rather than throwing it on the trash heap.
Exactly. Now, you don't throw things that are actually sanctified, just throw them away. They have to be disposed of properly.
So the offspring, the reason that it's impure is because it's old?
Not necessarily. What they're talking about, I'm saying that sometimes you burn meat, just the sacrifice meat, because it's expired from the sacrificial window. But sometimes it became defiled. Sometimes, well, there's all sorts.
An example of the father and the offspring.
Well, imagine somebody who had gone to the funeral, took care of the body, came home, touched the meat, not knowing that it was truma, that it was something that was supposed to be pure. The meat has now become a secondary level of ritually impure. And then imagine another piece of meat that was in the room with the person when he died, which is a higher level. Can you throw them into the fire at the same time?
And both of these are in a priest's home?
Well, truma. So truma is we are talking about truma, right? No, they're talking about any sacrificial meat. We're doing truma later. That's right. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So any sacrificial meat, whether it was in the priest's home or whether it was in the temple precinct or anything else, if it comes into one of these categories, you have to dispose of it. You can no longer eat it, and you can't just throw it away. But the question is, if they became different levels, can you burn different levels at the same time? Does that make sense? Right. And the answer from Rabbi Hanina is yes. I know this sounds really like it's kind of out of left field. That was the preface before, which is these concepts of ritual impurity really don't have a physical feeling for us anymore like they did in the ancient world, because our life doesn't revolve around the temple sacrificial service. But I promise it's building to something, and it's building to something that has to do with Passover. I promise. So the question is, can you burn them together? The answer is yes, you may. And furthermore, part 2.
Rabbi Akiva added and said, during all the days of the priests, they did not refrain from lighting oil which had been rendered unclean by a tevul yom in a lamp which had been made unclean by one who had contracted, I think it's probably contracted,
Contracted.
yeah, corpse impurity, even though they had uncleanness to its uncleanness.
Right? So when you go to light the oil, if you're a tevul yom, that's somebody that was ritually impure, has gone to the mikveh, but the day hasn't finished yet. For the priest, there was a particular window that you went to the mikveh, but you were still considered a little impure until the day was done. And that if that person touched the oil, it becomes a little unclean, whereas something that's come into contact with a corpse is very unclean. You can still mix them together and light the torch, light a lamp. These would not be used, by the way, in the actual temple. This would be like lighting your home lamp. But it's okay, even though you're mixing the two oils, and one is a little unclean and one is very unclean, it's okay to go ahead and burn them up together. Okay? Okay. So the idea is two different degrees of impurity and 2 different degrees of impurity can still be consumed, can be burnt at the same time, which is going to lead us to Mishnah 7.
Mishnah 7, Rabbi Meir said, from their words we learn that we may burn clean teruma together with unclean teruma on Pesach.
Okay, so here's the problem if you are a Kohen, if you are a priest. Passover comes around and you've got a load of truma, hopefully. Truma was the gift of food that was given to the priests by the other people, by the rest of us. And truma is considered to be semi-sacred. It was a gift to the priests, not because we like the priests, but because God told us to give gifts to the priest. And so therefore the priest can only eat it when he is priestly-ish, which means the priest has to be ritually pure before he can eat it. His family can eat it as long as they're ritually pure. So it's kind of special food for the priest. Well, Passover comes along, and a lot of that truma is probably chametz. What do you do with it? Right? Normal chametz, as we see, we get rid of it, and we're going to talk about that in Mishnah 2. We're going to talk about that in chapter 2. But truma, can you get rid of truma the same way as you get rid of everything else? And what about truma that became unclean? Can you get rid of it along with truma that is still ritually pure at the same time? How do you handle this disposal? That's the issue. And Rabbi Meir says, because of what we just learned about the sacrificial meat and about the oil, we can deduce that truma that is unclean and truma that is clean can be disposed of together, can burn them up together. All right? Not so, says Rabbi Yossi.
Rabbi Yossi says that is not a proper analogy.
All right, so this is that great Jewish analytical tradition of why doesn't this work, right? We just saw, let me go ahead and erase this. We just saw that with the, I'm just going to use the word meat because it's shorter, right? We've got the meat 100 and the meat 50 combined is okay, right? No problem. Oil 100, oil 50, we can burn them together. Okay, right? So truma, and truma, says Rabbi Meir, isn't that okay? And what's the problem for Rabbi Yossi?
He says that it's not a proper analogy.
Right, so he says you can't learn this answer from this case from these because there's something different happening here. What numbers do I fill in here? From the beginning, from what Rabbi Meir says.
It should be the same.
Should be. Look at it
No,
carefully.
yeah, you're right. Maybe 100% and 0.
Ah, the zero is the important
Make
one,
a difference. Yeah.
right? So what Rabbi Yossi's pointing out is saying, one of these things is not like the other, right? To go back to Sesame Street, that this analogy doesn't, you can't draw a conclusion from these for this. Because adding more uncleanness to something that's already unclean, that's okay. Adding uncleanness to something that is not unclean, that would be deliberately making something that is ritually pure, truma,
Yeah.
ritually impure. And deliberately doing that, we don't do that. That's not good. See the distinction he's making? Yes, I know. It would be nice if they used a few more words, but this is what we got. So,
3.
Yep.
And Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua agree that each is burned separately.
right?
He
So,
agrees with Yosef.
well, they agree, but in the great Jewish concept, agreeing isn't enough. We have to know why you agree. Because sometimes you'll both agree for different reasons. This is like in the Supreme Court, where you have concurring opinions, right? I agree with the majority in the conclusion, but my analysis is for a different reason. And it's important to know the reason. Because remember, in Judaism, the whole point of Mishnah and then Talmud isn't just that you can memorize all the answers, it's that you can memorize the method to get to the answers. So knowing the reasoning of the sages, that's the whole point, not just memorizing the answers.
So, A, concerning what do they disagree in respect of doubtful teruma and unclean teruma? I, Rabbi Eliezer says each is burned separately, but Rabbi Yoshua rules both together.
Right? So the question becomes, if it is doubtful truma and unclean truma, if we're not 100% sure of the status, then do we err on the side of caution? Or do we say, no, the doubt introduces enough of doubt that we don't have to be worried about the mixing of these two? And that they disagree on. Make sense? Maybe? Okay. That's it for chapter 1. Should we move on to chapter 2? Excellent. Move the copies down to this side of the room. Take one and pass it on. Okay. So up until now, we've been talking about eating chametz, right? That you are prohibited from eating chametz, so we have to make sure that we get rid of it. We have to make sure what time we stop eating it, and all of that. Yes? Good. But there's another idea in Judaism as well that's a prohibition for chametz, and that's hana'ah. That means to benefit from the chametz. Right? So you're not allowed to eat it, and you're not allowed to benefit from it. And that's what we're going to hit now, is it's not me that's eating it, but I still have to be careful with it. And that's going to become a topic for the next few Mishnayot. All right, Yerach, we're at chapter 2, Mishnah 1.
Mishnah 1. Any hour in which one is permitted to eat chametz, one may feed it to cattle, beasts, and birds, and one may sell it to a Gentile, and benefit from it is permitted.
All right, so remember, just like we were talking about last week about, what time of the day is it, and then you cut the line. Remember the loaves up on the top of the temple to tell you when it was? While that's going, and it's okay to eat it, it's also okay to keep feeding your cows with it, benefiting from it, and to be selling it to people, and anything else you want to do with it. Right? It's still fine to use it. Not just about eating, but also benefiting. Make sense? Okay. But
when its time has passed, benefit from it is forbidden, and you may not even fire on an oven or stove with it.
you can't even take your old bread and use it to cook something new. You can't cook your soup. You can't warm yourself with it. You can't even use it as fuel in the oven, which is kind of unusual because of what the next part of the Mishnah says.
Rabbi Yudah says there is no removal of chametz except by burning.
Right. So how do you get rid of chametz?
Burning.
You burn it,
Yeah.
but you better not be using the burning. If it's after the time, right? So if you do the bior chametz, the burning of the chametz early enough, then yeah, theoretically you could warm yourself by the fire and you're okay. But if you're doing it late and you're burning the chametz, you better not be using it for anything, because benefit from chametz, even as fuel for a fire, not eating, not selling, but just burning as fuel
It's
that's
a
needed,
benefit.
is still a benefit. And that's how far the restriction goes, that you should not benefit from chametz. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Makes sense. So even to this day, when you get rid of the chametz, we do bior chametz. We burn the chametz. But of course, there's a question from the Chachamim. Is it really, as Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Yehuda said, that it's only gotten rid of by burning? Is there no other way to get rid of your chametz? What if you don't have any matches?
But the sages say he may also crumble it and throw it to the wind or cast it into the sea.
Right? So bior chametz, there's time for destruction of the chametz come the morning of the day before Passover. You need to get rid of it, and you have nothing to burn it with. What do you do? Any ideas?
Feed it to the animals.
Or feed it to the animals.
Feed it to the wild birds.
Wild, yeah.
Maybe.
Throwing it to the wind.
Throw it to the wind. Well, whatever happens to it. So what happens afterwards is not your concern. Just like casting it into the sea, it doesn't matter whether ducks eat it or fish eat it or whatever.
Yeah.
What matters is you're not benefiting from it. And what the sages are saying is that burning is nice, and indeed burning continues to be the main traditional form for getting rid of chametz right up until this day. And I know that my kids and I, we always have a lot of fun gathering around the fire when we burn the chametz, and it's kind of our, it's a very special family moment in getting ready for Pesach. By the way, a little trick I learned a number of years ago is if you save your lulav from Sukkot, you can use the palm frond and the wrapper parts to start the fire, because it starts like lightning. It's just so dry and perfect. It's better than paper. And then you can really remember that Sukkot is the last of the Chag, the Chagim, the major holidays, and it leads right into Pesach. So it's sort of linking the whole calendar year together. But if you don't have a fireplace, you don't have a fire, your landlord doesn't want you burning on the balcony, whatever the problem may be, you can flush your chametz down the toilet. That's casting the chametz into the sea.
To the sea. Yeah.
Exactly right. You can go up to your balcony and you can crumble it into dust and throw it over the edge and just clean your hands and say it is hefker. It is ownerless as the dust of the earth. So there are other ways to get rid of your chametz rather than burning if burning is not an option.
So for pets, since we don't use them for livelihood, can they still consume?
Generally speaking, no.
No.
So it's a little bit more complicated depending upon the quality of the food, as we're going to see a little bit later. One of the statuses of something that makes it chametz is that it is edible by a dog. So certain types of food a dog won't eat, but other pets will. And generally that kind of is on the cusp of whether it's permitted. But when it comes to a dog, dogs can eat well for a week. Right, you make your own home dog food for them, or you buy dog food that is, generally not filled with chametz products, and then you can serve that to them. But yeah, for the dog, it's kind of on the cusp with our modern dog food of what you feed them. And other animals, certainly you can find alternatives for what to feed them as well. Cows, sheep, generally they don't eat actual chametz, as we're going to see, because we're going to see what is actual chametz. It's not just everything. There's a limit to what counts. And there's plenty of things they can't eat. Interestingly enough, rice becomes a very viable option. But I'm sure we'll talk about rice eventually. But let's talk about this whole benefit issue a bit more in chapter 2, Mishnah 2.
Okay. Chametz, which belongs to a Gentile, over which Pesach has passed, is permitted for benefit.
All right. So we have to make sure we understand this implied concern here. Benefit, when the sages say that the Torah prohibits benefiting from chametz from Pesach, they're not just talking about benefiting from chametz during Pesach. They are saying you're not allowed to benefit from any chametz that was in your possession ever again. If you owned it during Passover and you didn't get rid of the chametz and Passover is over, you're still not allowed to benefit from it. You're still not allowed to eat it. Let's imagine that I just really love my donut collection. And Passover comes along and I say, I'm not going to eat my donuts because it's Passover, but I'm not going to sell them to a non-Jew. I'm not going to get rid of them. I'm just going to wrap them up and put them away. But they're still mine. They're my donuts, my special donuts. And after Passover, I'll open the box and then I'll have them. And once a chametz item has been owned by a Jew during Passover, it becomes forbidden to any Jew forever, right? So let's say your neighbor has this weird donut thing, and you know that during Passover he never gets rid of his donuts, and then the day after Passover he invites you over to his house, and he says, "Here's one of my special donuts that I saved." I'm sorry, I can't eat those donuts. Those donuts are not just prohibited to him, they are prohibited to all Jews ever, because any chametz that was owned by a Jew during Passover becomes prohibited forever. This is why Passover is very strict and why people take the laws of chametz very seriously. Because it's not just enough to put it in the garage. It has to no longer be in your possession. And so the question comes up in our Mishnah. Well, the answer comes up in the Mishnah to a question you may not have known you had, which is, okay, so this is Jewish chametz, right? But what about, how do I write non-Jewish? No, star, chametz, right? What about that chametz? It's the non-Jew chametz. My neighbor is not Jewish, and he loves his donuts, and he keeps them all during Passover because he's not Jewish, so, And then he invites me over, and I know the donuts are kosher, so let's not worry about that. It's the day after Passover. Can I eat his donut or not? He owned it during Passover. Yeah. No problem. Yeah. Right? Chametz, which belongs to a Gentile over Passover, even though they owned it during Passover, no problem. Because they don't have a mitzvah to get rid of it. It's fine for them. There's no commandment saying non-Jews have to also get rid of chametz. There's no commandment saying non-Jews can't own a chametz during Passover. It's not their commandment, it's ours. So their chametz is fine for me to benefit from or even eat if it's kosher after Passover passes. Make sense?
This comes probably the mechirat chametz.
Well, this is right. This is part of the underpinning of why the sale of chametz works. Because if it's owned by him and not by me, then I'm not benefiting from my chametz. I'm benefiting from his chametz, and that's okay. At least after Passover. And then part two.
Part two. But that of an Israelite is forbidden for benefits, as it is said, no leavened bread shall be found with you.
Right, so going back to our verse from Exodus, no leaven with you, which means you never get to have it ever again. So it's just reinforcing what we've got here. All right. Shall we make this a little more complicated?
I think actually it's clear.
Yeah, good. Then let's make it more complicated. Mishnah 3.
If a Gentile lent money to an Israelite on his chametz after Pesach, is it permitted? It is permitted to use.
Okay. So a Gentile lends me money on my chametz. On my chametz, collateral. My chametz is my collateral. Right? So he lends me 100 zuzim. Right, or 100 denarii, 100 gold coins. And he says, okay, so this 100 gold coins I'm giving you, if you don't pay it back, what's mine? What's the collateral? Because there's not that I don't trust you, Rabbi Neely, but 100 gold coins, I want some collateral. And I say, don't worry, I have this lovely warehouse full of donuts. They're special donuts. Okay, so he lent me the money, and it's secured by my donut collection. And Passover comes and goes. Is the donut collection permitted to me or not? According to the Mishnah.
Tough one.
Like I said, let's make it hard. What did the Mishnah say, though?
It says, yes, it is permitted.
Yes, it is, right? So, because
It says yes.
right, because effectively, that's probably the best English word, right? So, effectively, the security is the temporary property of the non-Jew who loaned me the money until I pay him back, right? Because until I pay him back, that's his, because that's what's making sure I pay him back.
Yeah.
So even though it's my collateral, it's his claim that overrides its ownership during the Chag, during the holiday. So it's his during Passover, and therefore afterwards I can enjoy it. I can benefit from it. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Right? So even though it's just collateral, that's enough to transfer the umbrella of ownership to the loaner, the person who loaned me the money during that time period. Make sense? And if you think about it, this is something that most of us kind of intuitively understand, right? If someone loans us money based around our car, right? Our car is our collateral. I can't go out and cut the top of my car off with a saw, because I'm damaging the collateral that the other person has it secured against. It's not right for me to damage something that belongs to the person as collateral until I've repaid the loan. Right? That person does have a claim on the intactness of their security of that collateral. So we do really have this idea intuitively. It's just most of us don't think about it with chametz because we deal with money and houses and cars, not with bread. But in the ancient world, there wasn't as many individual possessions, and so food might be your wealth. Remember, for much of the ancient world, as tithing shows us, the main way that you contributed to the government or the well-keeping of the poor or the well-being of the Levites or the Kohanim was by giving a percentage of food, because that was what you had. So securing your loans with food would be perfectly reasonable in the ancient world. Probably the more natural thing to do than securing it with other items. Okay. But on the other hand,
but if an Israelite lent money to a Gentile on his chametz,
that's the Gentiles' chametz.
Yeah. After Pesach, it is prohibited from use. So it's the reverse now.
Exactly. So it's the reverse. So because I've secured the loan I made to him on his chametz, it's considered to be mine when Passover rolls around. Can't use it. Even if it reverts back to the Gentile, right? Even if the chametz gets back into his possession, it still was my possession during Passover, which means even though it comes down and goes like that, here nullifies it forever. Right? If it was in a Jew's possession during Passover, even if it reverts to the non-Jewish ownership afterwards for whatever reason, I can't benefit from it as a Jew.
Does that mean you can't enter into a contract like that then?
Not around Passover time, no. Most of the contracts in the ancient world were short term. They didn't have like 5-year terms, secured with your donut collection. But if it was around Passover, you did have to be careful of what were you offering as security. If you were offering as security your shop, then you'd have to say, well, wait a minute, what's in the shop? Because I can't loan you money against what's in your shop if what's in your shop is chametz and Passover is only a week away, because that doesn't work. So yes, it meant that it did prevent certain types of contracts at certain times of the year. So yeah, Pesach sticks its nose into a lot of things. It's a very pushy holiday. However, lest you think we're being unreasonable, here we go.
3. If ruins fell on Hametz, it is as if it has been removed.
But give me the caveat from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel.
Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, provided that the dog cannot search it out.
Okay, so, I've got, I'm going to draw a picture of this, why not? So I've got my lovely little house over here. That is my special house where I keep my special donuts. And that's where I keep them all year. And unfortunately, there was an earthquake and the house collapses. Oh no, my donuts, right? Well, the donuts are still in there, and they may be a little crushed. The jam donuts, maybe not so good, but the donuts are still in there. And if I could get them out, they would be edible. But because they've been collapsed, I don't have to dig out the entire ruin and destroy them before Pesach. Because that's the alternative. The alternative would be to say, I'm terribly sorry to hear about your house collapsing. When would you like help digging out your chametz? Because, Pesach is coming in a couple hours. What? If it's destroyed by the ruins, it's considered to be destroyed as far as Pesach goes. You're fine. As long as Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says,
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, provided that the dog cannot search it out.
If the dog can get in there and find your donuts, that's not really destroyed by the ruin. Right? That's just a little covered, and that doesn't count. Then you could possibly benefit from the chametz. It's just it's an alternative storage method for your food, and that doesn't count. You have to then get it out and destroy it in order for you to be ready for Pesach. Make sense? Yay? Nay? Okay. All right. Okay, let's try Mishnah 4. This one, this might spin our brain. We'll see.
Okay. One who unwittingly eats teruma chametz on Pesach must repay to a priest the principal plus a fifth.
Go ahead and read part 2 because we gotta do a lot of explaining to get this work out.
Intentionally, he is exempt from payment and from liability for its value as fuel.
Okay. Yeah. Back to Truma. Remember what I said before, that Truma was a gift that you would separate from your food and that you would give to the priest. What happens if you've separated it for the priest, but you haven't delivered it to the priest yet? The food is still considered Truma, right? So I've got this is my pile of food and my smaller pile of Truma. And normal day, not Passover, just normal day, I come home, it's late at night, I'm not looking carefully, and I grab an apple from my pile of Truma, and I eat my apple. That wasn't my apple, that was the Kohen's apple, right? That was the Truma apple, and I've stolen from the Kohanim, literally. I've taken from their property. Their property is currently in my house, but once I've separated it and designated it, it doesn't really belong to me, it belongs to them. And in the case of this type of theft, you have to repay the price of the apple plus 20%. There's a penalty that goes along with that kind of misappropriation of sacred objects. Pesach. Okay, so what's the problem with Pesach? Of eating something that is chametz. What is the value of something that is chametz that belongs to a Jew during Pesach? Zero, right? Chametz on Passover is 0, right? There is no value to it. but it doesn't belong to me. If I eat something that's worthless, that I normally would have to pay a penalty for eating it, do I still have to pay the penalty or not? And the answer for this Mishnah is that yes and no. If you did it by mistake, yes. If you ate it intentionally, no. No, you don't pay. That's the weird thing, right? If I come in and I'm stumbling through the dark and I grab an apple, or not an apple because it's got to be chametz, I grab a loaf of bread and I chow it down, and then I go, not only was that chametz, but it was truma chametz. You look up the value of bread on your local supermarket chart, you add 20%, and you give that to the priest. You make a payment.
But why did you have it in your house?
Okay, so this is kind of the problem that they are trying to give us a little bit of an understanding with in the commentary. And the Talmud goes into this, because the basic question is, what are you doing with chametz still in your house if it's now chametz to the point where it's worthless and causing this whole math problem of 0 times anything? So if you look down at the commentary, we got a couple different options. So actually, the introduction explains it as well. So if you got a non-priest who eats Pesach Truma, which is also chametz, if you have separated the Truma before Pesach, and you've done that from the chametz, or you separate the Truma from the matzah, and then the matzah became chametz, right? Then what is the issue? What's the problem? Because matzah can become chametz if it is put under certain circumstances where it can become chametz unintentionally. Remember, in the old days, people made their own matzah. It wasn't something that you just went down to Winn-Dixie and bought from the end cap, the kosher section. Matzah was something that most people would make at home. And so if you were making it and you made a mistake and it turned to chametz, and then you realized you'd not only made a mistake with it by becoming chametz, but that it was also truma, what do you do? Or what if you were separating it from the chametz, and then, as he puts at the bottom here, even though it was forbidden to derive benefit, that you may have that you would have not normally thought that it was there. So you get confused, like we all are. And you end up with chametz, and you end up with chametz truma, and you end up eating the chametz truma. If you did it on purpose, knowing that it was, so if you did it a mistake, not knowing that it was truma, and presumably not thinking it was chametz, but you then realize later that it was truma, then, and that it was chametz, then you have to pay, right? That's section 1. Mm-hmm. But if it is clearly chametz and it's Pesach, even though it's truma, which normally would be considered stealing, you're not stealing from anyone, because the Kohen can't own it, right? Now, you're still in trouble, by the way, for eating chametz on Pesach. But what they're pointing out is that you're not in trouble for a payment. Now, if you took it unintentionally, then mentally it did belong to the priest. If you took it intentionally, then mentally you knew it didn't, because you knew what you were doing. And that's where intentionality becomes very important. But as you can see, you end up sometimes going around this way to get there. It's taking the long road. All right, now I'm not expecting Mishnah 4 to be all that clear. It is a very complicated idea, but the point is that if you know what you're doing and it is chametz, then you know that it doesn't belong to the priest. If you don't know what you're doing, then you don't know that it's chametz. Then in the mind of the truma, it does belong to the priest, and therefore you do owe the value of what was taken. Right? Knowledge changes reality. Maybe that's probably the clearest summary for this. Right? According to Judaism, what we know changes what is, changes the status of items. And that is a very, very important idea over and over again throughout the Mishnah as a whole, throughout all of Jewish law, is that what did you know and when? And that makes, if you've ever studied the laws of lost and found, knowing what the person who lost it knows at the time that you find it makes a big difference. And that can get really complicated. All right, let me just double check here. You know what? We're going to pause there. I know we still have 10 minutes left, but we're going to get into kind of the biggest section here, which is what makes chametz chametz. That is to say, what species of grain or food actually can become chametz. So you're welcome to read ahead, and we can have a lively discussion next week about rice and beans and other things. But I don't think in the amount of time we've got left that we've got time to do it justice. And I don't like getting into a Mishnah without being able to round it out. Okay? You forgive me? Okay. Well, if I hadn't talked about all that, Truma stuff, we could have gotten to it.
Rabbi,